I am the Executive Director of IWRAW Asia Pacific, and I'm very pleased to be the co-moderator of this webinar together with Shubha Chako. IWRAW Asia Pacific is a collaborator with the BRICS Feminist Watch that is organizing this webinar, and with other collaborators, the South Center, the Inequality Movement, the GenDev Center for Research and Innovation. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Our topic for this afternoon, evening, morning, however, wherever you are, is about IFIs and the use of country systems and the implications of that for gender equality. As we all know, the international financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the regional banks, all wield considerable power in framing and implementing the global financial system and governance. The neoliberal orientation of these institutions, their policies and their programs and their lending conditionalities shape global rule setting and also the design of national level policies and practices. And this affects the lives of millions of children, women, men, and trans people in developing economies in the global south. During this very distressing period of a global pandemic, countries are heavily leaning on the IFIs. In the pre-COVID world, the IMF approved 18 programs a year on average. Today, they have 100 members knocking on their door. Both the IMF and the World Bank, however, even at this time of crisis, seem to be pushing policies and lending conditionalities that we feminists have long argued are detrimental to meeting governments' human rights obligations or fostering gender equality. The IMF seems to have returned to pushing austerity economics for recipient countries, and the World Bank seems to have intensified the maximizing finance for development approach that prioritizes private over public interest. The new kid on the block in this international financial architecture is the New Development Bank, the NDB, or the BRICS Bank, to give it a more popular identity. This was set up in 2014 by the BRICS countries. The NDB is seen as an alternative to the global North domination in the global financial architecture, though it seems to be following some of the same paradigms as the established players. The NDB centers the concept and the practice of the use of country systems that the IFIs led by the World Bank embraced in 2004, 2005. So what is this use of country systems? The use of country systems emphasizes the centrality of national regulation and domestic public policies, and also of financial management procedures that includes procurement, taxes, and profit remittances. This approach was a response to voices from the South, from the global South, asking for greater say and control over investments that flowed to their countries. The concept is reiterated in the Paris Declaration for Aid Effectiveness, in the Busan Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, and where recipient countries have agreed to strengthen their national systems of public financial management and procurement, and donors have committed to use them to the maximum extent possible. So today, what we are trying to look at is to learn and share the experiences of the New Development Bank and other global financial systems and instruments and their use of country systems. If using country systems are indeed putting countries in the driving seat of decision-making on financing for development, and then financing for development, then given that most of these countries and the BRICS states in particular have signed up to, say, to CEDAW, this Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, how can we actually leverage this concept to achieve gender equality and non-discrimination at a national level? This is the key question that we are going to debate today. So to guide us through this conversation and mutual learning, we have a number of very impressive speakers who will approach these issues from very diverse perspectives. But before I go and introduce them and before we go hear them talk, let me invite Shubha Shako to say a few words about how participation in this event will be facilitated and what you can do to share your views and make the conversation a really vibrant one. Over to you, Shubha.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for coming in. Good morning, good afternoon, different time zones. So quite amazing the turnout is. We have over 130 registrations. I'm Shubha Chako and I'm with Solidarity Foundation. I work largely on issues around sexuality, but I'm here as also a member of the BRICS Feminist Watch. The sessions that we will have are divided into two. So we have one session with 3 speakers, after which we'll have a questions that the moderator will pose to the speakers, following which we will have questions that you as the audience can pose to them. Please put down your questions in the chat box and I will curate and present some of them to the panelists. We have a second session which follows the same format of 3 speakers, the moderator posing some questions, and then questions from the audience. And after which we have the discussant's response, and we have questions from you specifically about future direction, and then we will have a rapid round where the panelists will give us recommendations and thoughts for the future. Thank you so much and looking forward to a great session. Raj and Achyuta now backing us with technical support from South Center. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much, Shubha. So let me go to the first session. We have 3 speakers on the first session. We have Ella Hopkins from the Bretton Woods Project in the United Kingdom. We have Preeti Daruka from BRICS Feminist Watch India. And we have Sibulele. Is she here yet?
Yes, she is.
Okay, Sibulele Poswayo from the Inequality Movement or the BRICS Feminist Watch South Africa. So I'll start with Ella. Thank you very much for being with us. If you can give us a quick overview of the genesis and application of the use of country systems in the Bretton Woods institutions, why it was adopted and how it was used, and how has the NDB adopted or used this concept. Please also say a few words about yourself before you start.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I hope you're all well and keeping safe. My name is Ella Hopkins. I'm the Senior Gender Project Officer at the Bretton Woods Project. We're a watchdog of the IMF and the World Bank based in London in the UK. So my work focuses on looking at the gendered impacts of World Bank macroeconomic policy, particularly the conditions attached to its lending. I'm also the co-chair of the UK's Gender and Development Network's Women's Economic Justice Group. And I just wanted to say thank you for organising this session and inviting me to speak. I'm really looking forward to hearing all of the other presentations and learning much more about the New Development Bank and other regional development banks as well. So firstly, just to address briefly the genesis and application of the use of country systems at the World Bank. The World Bank says it has been using a country systems approach in its development financing since 2004. The bank defines country systems as a country's national, subnational, or sectoral implementing institutions and applicable laws, regulations, rules, and procedures. So using country systems was therefore kind of framed by the bank as a way for them to enhance what they would call country ownership and not intervening in domestic affairs, which they highlighted would improve the sustainability of development projects. The bank rolled this out namely for its environmental and social framework, which took effect in 2018. And this framework sets out the mandatory requirements for the bank to follow through investment project financing, which is its lending instrument that provides financing for a specific project, often big infrastructure projects, but also education and health projects as well. And at the time this new framework was announced, many civil society and human rights groups, you might have been part of this, some of you yourself, were quite disappointed. that the safeguards did not necessarily align with human rights standards, including CEDAW, and many argued that they actually watered down existing safeguards in many cases. And there were a lot of critiques that the new safeguards had quite vague language, loopholes, flexible principles, which it was argued kind of reflected a race to the bottom in terms of requirements around social and environmental due diligence. And from the standpoint of many civil society groups, using country systems was quite a useful framing for the bank to shirk some of its own responsibility to meet human rights standards in its lending, and it allowed it to get around having really clear rights-based safeguards for itself. Of course, there are countless examples where bank projects don't meet human rights standards and cause significant harm to women or have deepened gender inequality, especially infrastructure projects, as many people on this call know and have documented. But I wanted to quickly highlight a recent example where some of these dynamics played out. So in March earlier this year, the World Bank approved a $500 million loan to the Tanzanian government for its secondary education program. And this came at a time when many Tanzanian human rights groups had documented the expulsion from school of girls who became pregnant, which was sort of permitted under Tanzanian education regulations and was endorsed quite enthusiastically by the president. And many human rights groups and parliamentarians in Tanzania saw the bank's approval of this loan as an endorsement of these discriminatory practices, especially because part of the loan, which was meant to address the issues, merely provided what the bank called alternative education pathways or parallel education centres for the girls who were expelled from school for being pregnant, which Human Rights Watch found to be, really inadequate compared with the mainstream education system. And one thing that really stood out to me was an interview where the World Bank's Vice President for Africa was asked about working with the Tanzanian government on human rights standards. And in response, he said that the bank is not supposed to get into issues of politics, which again speaks to this idea of not intervening in domestic affairs. But for all the talk of country ownership and sovereignty, of course, the bank has huge influence over countries' domestic policies in many different ways. So a very direct example is the bank's lending instrument called Development Policy Financing, which provides direct budget support to governments. And these loans, which are about a third of bank lending, come with policy conditions, where the bank requires governments to change laws and policies, often macroeconomic policies, often deregulatory policies. Of course, women's groups have been critiquing these types of loans for decades from a feminist perspective, in the previous iteration as structural adjustment loans as well. Just a quick personal plug, I have, building on a lot of this feminist work, I've written a briefing on this lending instrument and how it undermines women's rights with some recent examples. So I'll put that in the chat box in a bit. But this is just one example of what seems to me a massive inconsistency, where the bank is using a country systems approach when it suits and not when it doesn't. So how can country systems be leveraged to achieve gender equality and non-discrimination at a national level, rather than, as the Tanzanian education loan showed, the exact opposite, where it was used as an excuse to support discrimination? And for the new development bank, which others will speak about in more detail and with more knowledge later, this country systems approach was adopted right from the start. And if we think about it in relation to the World Bank, where decision-making is dominated by the US, European powers, Northern powers, I think it raises really interesting questions about South-South cooperation and how far that shift in the power of the governance of the institution can or does address some of the issues within how the country systems approach has been used by the World Bank. And I'm really interested to hear what the others who are working more on the NDB think about this, whether they think that the BRICS bank has the potential to make using country systems more effective, or whether it's just making the same mistakes. I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ella, for that, both the real example as well as your thoughts about the country systems and how they've been used in the Bretton Woods institution, particularly the World Bank. And we look forward to seeing your paper in the chat. So now I would ask Preeti who's from BRICS Feminist Watch India, and has done some work on monitoring some of the NDB and AIIB projects in India, to share her thoughts about how the NDB and use of country systems, how the NDB uses country systems in a way to kind of answer some of Ella's concerns as well. So Preeti, it's up to you. Please just say a little bit about who you are. I'm sure everybody here knows you, but just in case they don't.
Thanks so much, Priyanti, and good evening, good afternoon, good morning to all our participants on this webinar. It's a real pleasure to be here and to do the sharing, learning, and unpacking of this really agenda on country systems and how we can work with IFIs to use this or to promote gender equality. I'm founder and executive director of PWESCR International. It's a feminist human rights organization. We particularly work on women's economic, social, cultural rights. I'm also one of the founders of BRICS Feminist Watch. And what I'm presenting here draws from my engagement as BRICS Feminist Watch, monitoring NDB projects and AIP projects, particularly in India, and my engagement with the NDB and AIB management in the last 2-3 years around this whole issue of gender equality. So in interest of time for this presentation, I would focus particularly on NDB. However, if anyone wants to learn more about what our findings was around AIIB, we can, if time allows, in the Q&A session, we can discuss, or would be happy to carry the discussion beyond this webinar. So as Ella mentioned, country systems have gained significant importance in all investments in the last 10-15 years. But it's also important to note that this was a major advocacy agenda that came from the South civil society and was based on improving the quality as well as giving emphasis to receiving countries' sovereignty and ownership. Banks like New Development Bank, being a South-based bank, provided momentum by committing to a much stronger use of country systems in its policy as well as strategy document. So let's look at what New Development Bank, how it looks at country system. As Priyanti mentioned, BRICS Bank or New Development Bank is a South-based, and it really projects itself from being different from other IFIs. In its 5-year strategy, which got adopted in 2017, it emphasizes the principle of South-South cooperation, that is horizontality and non-conditionality, as opposed to some of the other North-based IFIs. It makes us believe that New Development Bank will respect sovereignty and development strategy of grant-receiving countries. The emphasis is on borrowing countries' ownership. NDB's commitment in its policy, at least on paper, is to work with national systems as key components of their partnership agreement. This includes working with national institutions, national legislation, regulations, oversight procedures, etc. Country system is what NDB claims is its starting place, and then to see where the gaps are and what needs to be addressed to build capacity of these South countries. In its environment and social framework also, NDB lists the use of country system as one of its core principles, aimed to build its policy procedures and operational standards. NDB states that the use of country system is aimed to achieve 2 goals. One is, of course, risk management, which is, as Priyanti said, financial management or ensuring managing any negative impacts on environment or vulnerable groups. The second is strengthening of local structures or building capacity of borrowing countries, as NDB believes that the best way to achieve sustainable development in the long term is strengthening these countries' capacity. So all looks good on paper. The question is, how is it all being implemented and operationalized? The bank states that it conducts assessment of borrowing countries' national systems and addresses gap and build capacity and provide technical support. The question is, how are national systems assessed against international standards of human rights, gender equality, and environment justice? What are the tools to fill the gaps? How is transparency of assessment criteria ensured? What are the monitoring mechanisms? What are the appropriate cooperation instruments for the strengthening of national systems beyond a specific project. So it's not just that it's an ad hoc approach, but it's a sustainable building capacity approach. What are the remedies available for situations in which a country system is weakened in course of project or program? And what are the appropriate indicators to measure the success or failures of this approach in context? And in context of all these questions, NDB doesn't seem to really have a plan or a policy. So what we found was NDB puts this down as a very strong commitment in both its strategy document as well as in environment and social framework. But beyond that, it has not demonstrated any plan or policy in how it will go about operationalizing this. Till date, NDB has approved around 60 projects in 5 of its member countries. However, these country assessment reports have not been made public. NDB, out of all the IFIs, what we found is one of the most opaque and doesn't disclose anything. Now, project information is available on their website or is in any public domain. At one of CSO forums in Shanghai with NDB management, BRICS Feminist Watch, as a representing BRICS Feminist Watch, I asked NDB's compliance officer about providing more project information, including pre-assessment report, and just to ensure that they are actually following what they say on paper. The response I got was that, does Indian law or country systems require an IFI to disclose assessment report and other project details? So the ball was thrown back into our court that we had to first convince them that they have to do this. Priyanti, you were saying something? So this was the first time we heard from NDB how they were using country system to hide behind any violation or any confrontation that we would do. This is what led to BRICS Feminist Watch to think about that we would need to get smarter with country systems, and hence the idea of this webinar came about. Now let's look at what NDB believes in gender equality, both in terms of ESF, its environment and social framework. Gender equality is important to successful and sustainable economic development, and accordingly considers it imperative to mainstream gender equality issues in its operation. However, NDB's 5-year strategy document adopted in 2017 does not have the word gender or women in it. The entire document totally does not mention anywhere the word gender or women. Projects are selected without gender criteria. The bank has neither defined gender equality nor integrated gender issues in its structure or operations. BRICS Feminist Watch since 2017 in discussion with NDB management has highlighted 3 key points in ensuring gender mainstreaming throughout its structure and operation. We have asked for NDB to set up an external multi-stakeholder gender advisory, giving it the mandate to develop a gender policy for the bank, and then to establish an internal gender unit with senior gender experts to guide NDB's gender mainstreaming processes. Now, by monitoring NDB projects in India, what it relieved was, what we found out, key findings was that NDB believes large infrastructure projects such as road, water management, etc. are totally gender neutral. Women's reality are ignored. Therefore, these projects indirectly perpetuate gender inequality, and gender is not part of any assessment of country systems. Men benefit more from these projects, both in terms of employment and gaining better infrastructure in the short run and as well as long run. Project failed to see women as development or economic agent, but only as a vulnerable group that needs to be taken care of, protected in terms of risk management. Hence, are not involved in any decision making or consultations. Project revealed several violations of gender equality and particularly labor rights and labor laws. We could not find any evidence that showed New Development Bank is actually addressing these gaps, setbacks in national systems, nothing around women's rights or gender equality. In absence of assessment reports, we could not conclude that assessment of country system was part of this assessment and monitoring. So there is no way for us to establish that they actually did an assessment of country systems. In country like India, we have elaborate laws and policy around equality, non-discrimination along gender, caste, religion, etc., all these categories. We also have well-elaborated labor laws. New Development Bank projects on the ground were found violating several of these national laws. These violations in several of our countries are not because of lack of adequate country systems, especially in BRICS country. All our countries have got very strong constitutions constitution, legal, as well as judiciary. The country systems are in place. So law and policies are there, but these violations are not due to country system, but because of country practices. For example, construction sector is known to be one of the notorious for labor rights violation, discrimination, and all kinds of exploitation. There's the largest number of informal work, there's discrimination, holding back of wages, long hours, sexual harassment, etc., etc. Any IFI funding infrastructure and relying heavily on construction sector for its project implementation, for example, in countries like India, therefore needs to pay particular attention to how country systems are violated through country practices. India's cases highlight that there are several problems, both in...
We might have to wind up.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
1 minute, and so in the closure, what I would sum, what we found with NDB was there are huge gap between NDB policy, project planning, and measures to strengthen country national systems. NDB itself doesn't have capacity, expertise to address any gaps in national systems around gender, because NDB itself is gender neutral in its structure, in its operation. NDB is unable to go beyond do no harm to women, looking at women only as a vulnerable or a risk management kind of a category, but is unable to be a gender justice champion or proactively promote gender equality to do some good. Gender is not integrated category, and therefore gender is a hit or miss. NDB doesn't have a strategy to strengthen gender within country system at national level. The strategy says it will provide technical assistance to country during project cycle, to provide assistance during implementation, increase monitoring and oversight. Can NDB that doesn't have a gender policy in place, or women in senior management position, or gender advisory committee to be in a position to evaluate national system capacity, law, policy, etc. around gender equality, actually be able to do this assessment of country systems with gender lens? I think I'll hold on my recommendation. I will stop here. I will hold my recommendations for later. Thanks so much. Yes. Sorry for going over.
Thank you, Preeti. And I'm sorry I went offline as well. So if next time that happens, I invite Shubha to just take over, please. That's the point of being co-moderators. I don't know what's wrong with my internet, but I would like now, without too much extra conversation, to invite Sibulele, who's also done similar work in South Africa, to give her presentation. You have 5 minutes, Sibulele, and please say something about yourself before you start. Sibulele, you're muted. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. I'd like to apologize for my voice. I have a bit of a flu, but I thought there was no way I could miss this opportunity to share our experiences as rural women on the ground in South Africa on issues pertaining to IFIs. But what we are concentrating on today is in relation to the new development bank. Firstly, in South Africa, we are blessed, one can say, to have a very active African Regional Center with leadership that is willing and able and is always available to engage with women on the ground, with civil societies. And that, I want to say, is probably because of effective country systems in South Africa. It is because we have a constitution that forces spaces to engage us. It is because we have activists that have the right to engage and take this right up. But I'd like to do two things today in 5 minutes. The first is to engage on the positives and negative experiences we've had around country systems. One of the only positive experiences is the fact that we are able to fight against these country systems. And the second thing, I'll just take a minute or two to share our experiences with the two main projects that we are working in that have given us these experiences. But just in the short background, I'm Sibile Raposayo. I'm the chairwoman of the Inequality Movement. We are a rural movement of rural women who are cross-cutting around women farmers who are unable or have no education whatsoever, but have great expertise in the work that they do. We are rural women that have your doctorates and some of us are professors, but the main thing is that we are all about free access to the right to freedom, to be able to engage with the country, the funds that are provided through IFIs. I have also led the gender working group in civil BRICS during the 2018 10th BRICS Summit, all the way to Fortaleza in 2013. One has been in civil BRICS. But let me just get to it without wasting more time. We have two projects that we've been monitoring. The first is funded by the New Development Bank, and it is in relation to an infrastructure water project which stems between two Southern African countries, one Lesotho and South Africa. Because of country systems in Lesotho and in South Africa, there have been great atrocities to rural women who have, one, been displaced, two, have had no opportunity to give consent for the project, three, have experienced unimaginable gender-based violence and femicide as a result of the negligence and inability of the IFIs to understand that the country systems are negative for the people, because if a country has no respect for the most marginalized, it is inevitable that they will want to fall back on the country systems. And so in this particular experience, what we've seen is great social and environmental safeguards compliance failure, one. Two, we've had a great undermining of women's rights as the most adversely affected in this infrastructure project. There's been lack of information sharing or no information sharing. There's been no access to those that are in power. There's been no access to language used, even in the documentations, even in the meetings. I mean, when you're talking of an African perspective, you talk about a language which talks to. When you are calling a meeting, you cannot have a meeting in an African context, in a rural African context, where you have both men and women in one space. There's one gender that will be silent. So that also talks to language. Fourthly, we talk about advocacy groups and movements who have no access to resources to fight for these women, who are always talking about these on social media because of the country system of freedom, if one wants to call it that. And there's been lack of access to the ministerial level where country systems are used. But most negatively is that the NDB work, the NDB projects, as they stand, they promote inequality to the T. When you look at the positives, one, you are able to engage internal ministries, particularly if you're a movement like the Inequality Movement, which is able to network and infiltrate ministerial meetings. So in the movement, we use both insider and outsider approaches to advocacy. So we would use the boardroom to engage a minister. Similarly, some of our movement members would use the outside approach, which would be a social media, consequence management, pushing, marching and protests. But also, on a positive light, is that we are able to hold the state accountable through the country systems, like the policies that are in place in the South African context. Just in a minute, I'd like to also engage on two main social infrastructure projects that were provided by the New Development Bank to departments in the country, one to the National Treasury, two to the Department of Social Development. Now, if you are an IFI and you provide funds to a department or a ministry, obviously you have systems in your M&E strategy to ensure that there's environmental, there's social safeguards. The experience we've had with these two loans, one for COVID-related assistance, one to the Ministry of Health, one to Social Development for social infrastructure, because of the nature of corruption in the South African context, it has meant that we as ordinary citizens, ordinary active agents who fight for the rights of rural women, particularly so, have no access to one, calling for consequence management because it results in deaths. We've had no opportunities to access information because we are always told you need to engage with your country. Pretty has just shared with you that as the BRICS Feminist Watch, for years we've been calling, because we have an active ARC, we call our African Regional Center the ARC. Because we have an active ARC, we've been calling for an M&E strategy that engages and appreciates that even from the onset of your procurement processes, you need to ensure that you have a gender lens. Every time we raise these questions, we are told, go to your Ministry of Women. Yes, the Inequality Movement has all these access to all these ministers, but you will never be able to do it on your own because you need to go back as a movement and give the names, the different projects, the different communities, which activist, which woman activist in that particular community has given this. So it's a tight situation. I started off by saying we are blessed because we have a country system that is freedom. But it is that very country system, which is freedom, which allows the state to use its own freedom to infringe on the freedom of your most rural and your most marginalized community, which is your LGBTIQ, who always say, we don't have equal access because we cannot share who we are. That is what they say. And so the country systems, in the instances of the two NDP projects that we've been monitoring for the past 2 years, have brought nothing but pain for those that are said to bring positives. But we don't despair because we're fighting along and we are doing as much as we can to get as much resources, to get a voice, to share in spaces like this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sibulele. I think between the three of you, you have shown us that country systems the use of country systems is as good as country systems exist, as good as the country systems that exist. And if they do not exist, or they are not on the side of the marginalized and on the side of the people who are disadvantaged, then we cannot actually rely on them to actually produce a gender equality, right? So then, can I just ask you if I am right in that analysis, and also taking from Preeti's presentation where she said that there is no real understanding about how national systems are assessed. Can each one of you just give me a very quick answer about, considering this ground reality, how do you think we could actually, what can we do to actually make country systems work towards gender equality? Who wants to go? You don't have to go in that same order, but can I start with Ella anyway?
Okay, thank you. I'll try my best. Yeah, I think it's really challenging. But I think the concept of using country systems can be used to further gender equality and women's rights if it is used in line with countries' human rights obligations and frameworks. And as has been said, a lot of countries are signed up to CEDAW. Priti was speaking about human rights frameworks in India. I mean, yet the World Bank and to a degree as well, the NDB doesn't reflect this in its lending and kind of actively undermines human rights standards that are in place. So I mean, I think a place to start as a bare minimum, which the World Bank has yet to do, is having a mandatory gender safeguard and integrating gender into other safeguards, and also conducting gender impact assessments in line with human rights standards, both in designing a loan and afterwards for all lending. And as others have suggested, this could be done through a joint assessment by the Multilateral Development Bank with the state and other stakeholders, and then with a plan for kind of remedying gaps or shortcomings. But then also, I mean, are these banks in a position to do this? And I'm thinking of the World Bank, you know, an organization that does not adopt a rights-based approach. Is it in a position to conduct sort of women's rights impact assessments? So, I mean, that's the kind of bare minimum, but I think it also brings in other challenges, which I'm not sure quite what the solution is, but if others have ideas, I'd be really interested to hear them. And then the other takeaway, you know, particularly from what Sibulele was saying, is that country ownership is, of course, not just about governments, but about citizens and communities. So how do we make using country systems more about those people rather than just, I mean, it sometimes feels like a bit of a tick box for these development banks. We're working with the country, like tick, that's country ownership done, you know, just by working through the government. And yeah, that obviously doesn't take into account a whole host of a range of views from civil society to parliamentarians. So I think sort of reflecting on that a little bit as well.
Thank you so much. Is there something you would like to add to that, Preeti?
I just want to say, as such, I think we all think country system as a process, or in principle, it's a good idea. It was something that we all fought for it in the whole this development effectiveness from Paris, Accra, Busan, to get it in that document. However, it is being used as a scapegoat and putting blame on the countries as opposed to IFIs taking responsibilities also. So how it's of course the governments are accountable, but how do we bring that accountability to IFIs, as we know that they are powerful influence on the receiving government? So in recommendation, I would say that first of all, the IFI should have a robust gender policy which consistently integrates country system approach with the gender equality principle in it, and so has gender indicators at all levels. None of these IFIs, like NDB, doesn't have a gender policy and doesn't use any gender indicators in monitoring or assessing any projects or country system in that way. And so that would be, I would say, the starting place. And gender equality, these standards as elaborated by CEDAW. So how, as feminists, we can provide these knowledge piece or tools as also putting advocacy pressure on these IFIs to develop robust use of country systems. And building capacity of local actors would be important, particularly women leaders in this aspect.
And Sibulele, you seem to be doing that in your work, building the capacity of civil society to address these issues. Is there something, one takeaway you want to also add to this conversation?
Oh, yes. Well, just three things. One, the first thing is to build the capacity of not just civil society, because we have these spaces where we learn, we exchange knowledge. You need to build the capacity of the recipient in the Ministry of Women who's going to receive your email requesting you, when you request them, use country systems to respond to us. So there's lack of capacity at ministerial level. Two, you need to enhance and build the capacity of civil society on the CEDAW Convention, so that even when you are an organization that's working outside of gender issues, outside of IFI issues, but you understand that there's a convention that South Africa is part of and has to implement. And thirdly, our experience is that because in the African context, South Africa is said to be the gateway to Africa in the context of BRICS, right? When you have 2 or 3 countries in one project, like the one we're monitoring now, the water project we're monitoring now, you need to use your regional space. Use the African Union because they've got a declaration that calls on South Africa to lead. So you cannot have Lesotho able to have effective country systems and South Africa not able to have effective country systems, but they're implementing one project that deals with the same communities.
Thank you so much. I would ask Shruba to say whether there are any questions. I think the chat's been quite active. Do you want to share some questions to the panelists from the chat? We have about 5-6 minutes.
Yeah, so there have been some interesting questions. One question from Ping was about how do we link country systems. I can share all the questions and then you all can decide to take who takes it. So Ping had a question about how do we link country systems to human rights instruments and how do, or, you know, and international human rights instruments, or how do we make country systems more strong? And that's a question that other people have also asked, like how do we actually strengthen country systems? Because the dilemma is if you know, not to throw out the country systems if we wanted it, and then, but how do we hold them accountable and make them stronger? People have asked about AIIB and ADB, whether people have done some work around those, IFIs and what the findings are. And one last question was around how do you make infrastructure more gender sensitive?
Sorry, how do you make infrastructure more gender sensitive?
Yeah, the infrastructure projects, how do you make them more gender sensitive?
Can I start with the last one?
Yes, please. Go ahead. You have about a minute.
Because of the relationship we have with the ARC, they've asked us to work with them to mainstream gender in their M&E tool. So how are you going to have gender indicators? How are you going to mainstream gender? How are you going to ensure that gender, even at the beginning of the concept phase of a proposal that they receive, how do you ensure that even when you put out a call for a proposal, that gender is there? That is how you're going to make sure that infrastructure projects are gender sensitive, from having a gender lens from the beginning of your M&E tool. Of course, it's not going to be easy for us to work with the ARC because the challenge, of course, is just going to be they will use our resources and will tell us that they're now going to go to Shanghai and engage. But it's worth a shot because we're going to make noise about it when we've done so. So I believe that that is how you do it first. You first do it by making sure that at the onset of your M&E tool, gender is there. Nothing makes its way even to the second phase of conception level if there is no gender sensitivity. And gender sensitivity is not just about women. It is about all types.
Thank you. Preeti, do you have any comment on any of the 3 questions about how do we link country systems to human rights instruments? And I think maybe you'd like to say a little bit about the AIIB.
I was responding in the chat, and if you want, I can skip and let Ella in interest of time. But I just wanted to share those who were asking for how gender lens is used. I've given link to our BRICS Feminist Watch website, and we have our 3 reports where we have monitored infrastructure project from a gender lens in India. So that will give you a gender framework on infrastructure projects and also on AIIB.
Thank you. Ella, do you have something to say?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for your questions. Maybe to speak to the country systems and human rights instrument question. I'm not really in a position to sort of speak to country systems themselves, but if I think about kind of the perspective of IFIs using country systems and them kind of undermining human rights obligations, I think one of the challenges in addressing this is, of course, the huge power imbalance between IFIs and then the UN system, including treaty bodies. And I think addressing that and bridging that gap is really challenging and is a core part of the problem. So I think the more the UN system kind of engages with the IFIs as part of the picture, because sometimes it feels a little kind of separated out and kind of reminds the World Bank and regional development banks of domestic human rights obligations, the better. And that using country systems should include the human rights countries are signed up to. And the more that CSOs and women's groups are able to do that, the better as well. I know IWRAW has been doing amazing work looking at CEDAW and the IFIs. And then for groups based in the North, I think we can do more sort of challenging our own country's role as prominent shareholders of IFIs. I'm from the UK, so looking at, you know, what the UK is saying in UN circles compared to what it's doing on the World Bank board, and trying to bridge some of those gaps, I think is really key to linking country systems to human rights and the role that the IFIs play in kind of disrupting that.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that's a really good point about how all of us in our different spaces can have, have different points of advocacy that we can actually leverage to actually make sure that the system works, does not undermine the gender equality and non-discrimination principles that our countries have signed up to. So thank you so much, Preeti, Ella, and Sibulele for your interventions. We will now, and also Shubha for curating the chat. Thank you so much, and for all the people who asked the questions in the chat. We will now go to the next session where we will have Mariana Williams from the South Center, as well as BRICS Feminist Watch, I guess, and Patricia Chavez from Brazil, who is the executive director of the Espacio Feminista, which is a Brazilian feminist NGO. And she will tell us a little bit about it. And we have also Shusheng Zhao from China. These are our three speakers. I was asked Mariama to start. First, introduce yourself, please, say a little bit about yourself. And then I know that you have been working a lot with the environmental and social safeguards in the international financial system. So what are your perspectives about the use of country systems also in the framework of climate financing and all of that, and how all of that relates to the national policies of countries in the global south? So Mariama, for you.
All right, thank you very much, Priyanti. Thank you to the other panelists, Ella, Preeti, and Sibele. Thank you, very, very interesting discussion. My name is Mariama Williams. I am the coordinator of the Sustainable Development, Climate Change and Gender Program at the South Center. South Center is an intergovernmental think tank of developing countries. So we support developing countries in their negotiation on a wide range of topics, providing objective, independent research and analysis. And I'm particularly happy to be here. I'm not an expert on ESG, but I have a background many years ago working on IFIs and from the debt crisis perspective. And now I do a lot of work on women's empowerment in the context of climate change and climate finance. So I'll do some comparative between some of these funds and what I see in terms of the IIB a little bit and NDB. So first I propose just to do a little landscaping of what the ESG, and it goes by a different name. We're talking about environmental and social safeguards. So you hear ESS. The World Bank talks about environmental and social government, ESG. We also talk about environmental and social framework, ESF. So there's a whole permutation of these under these different umbrella. But however they're named, their nomenclature, they all refer to really the actions and measures and principles around ensuring that projects, programs, and policies do not harm people and the environment. That's fundamentally what they do, or to minimize the adverse effects to the physical environment, to the lives and the income and the access to resource and raw materials of the people who are living in the vicinity of the project area. And there are also indirect impacts that must be navigated. And this is what's been going on for a while now. And as the other panelists have said, it's a big area that the World Bank has been working on for many years, basically dragged kicking and screaming initially by civil society activists who argued that their bank's big projects were actually doing more harm than good, damaging the environment, and were not actually conducive to economic development and certainly not social development. And as a result of that, the bank has been developing its policies up until 2012. And then again in 2017, it floated a long consultation process, reviving its ESG framework. And so now what we have is the 2018 framework. Now, many international institutions follow not so much the World Bank 2018, because many of them already have grounded their ESG in the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, like the GCF, and many of the climate funds have used the IFC, which had a broader and more encompassing environmental and social safeguard than the World Bank. Now, the World Bank 2018 has come up to, in some respect, come up to some of that standard, and in some respect have backtracked on many things that civil society would have liked to have seen. And certainly, of course, the bank has been very consistent about that it's not, its mandate does not include engaging in human rights. And so that's something that is a fight that needs to be taken to also its board of directors, including the developed countries who sit on that board and who are also proponents of gender equality and women's empowerment. So we have this lack of coherence across the system, both from the people who put money into the system and those who are the users of that money. So these economic and social rights exist. They are quite detailed, and we won't go into the detail. The World Bank has about 10 of them. Currently in the World Bank 2018, IFC has about 8. So World Bank talks about ES1, looking at environmental and social risks, looking at labor and working condition, resource efficiency and pollution prevention management, community health and safety, land acquisition restrictions and land use and involuntary settlement. 6 is on biodiversity, conservation and sustainable management of living natural resources. 7 is on indigenous peoples, sub-Saharan Africa, historically underserved traditional local communities. 8 is on cultural heritage. 9 is on financial intermediary. 10 is on stakeholder engagement information. And so we could do a comparison and contrast between that and the IFC one that people have been using, which is the 2016 environmental safeguard, which is also what the AIIB has grounded itself on, and to a certain extent the NDB has kind of merged a little bit of both in its context, though it has a much narrower range of environmental social safeguard. So it's important. It was important at the beginning when the banks were being proposed, and many of us have said to them that it was important that they have an appropriate balance between development needs of developing countries, since they're South-South, and the requirement for protecting the environment and the social interests of people in the area living where they're funding. And so that they needed to consider how to impose standards that are appropriate, that will generate development, while at the same time reduce the manifold harms that the banks, whom they're supposed to be alternative to, have been using. Of course, that has not really fully resolved. We see that they have adopted. None of these banks have a normative framework, because the World Bank doesn't have. So if you're the model and you don't have a normative framework, it is darn hard to get the other persons who are modeling you to have a normative framework. The World Bank does not have a normative framework in its architecture for, it draws a little bit on labor conditions here, a little bit on it, but it doesn't have an overarching normative framework. So that would be the first thing. It does have gender sensitization. But again, I want to make 3 points, because I know I have 5 minutes. The ESGs, environmental social safeguard, 1, that is used by the IFIs, have the environmental social safeguards, they flag gender to some extent or not. The the NDB doesn't have a gender policy, as Priti has said. The AIB has a thing on diversity, a broad heading, and which gender is one of the many things that are diversely looked at. So none of these banks, these IFIs, have integrated gender with the environmental and social safeguard. I give you, and what I tell you what I mean like that. For example, the climate funds, right? The CEST, which is the Green Climate Fund, all of the climate funds, all have environmental and social safeguards. And all of their environmental safeguards, they're all interim at the moment, were grounded in IFC, the International Financial Corporation 8, right? 8 program area or operational area. But they also have gender policy. So they also gender mainstream at the same time. So for example, for the GCF, you cannot put a proposal in to the independent assessment panel, the technical panel, or to the secretariat that doesn't come with a gender assessment. All right. So now we have a lot of issues around the nature of the gender assessment. Okay. So I'm not pointing that this is perfect. A lot of issues around what kind of assessment they're using and how they're doing. But the fact is, there's a requirement that for them to put the proposal in, they must do not only environmental and social assessment, they must do a gender assessment. That's what I mean by integrating gender mainstreaming with your environmental social assessment. None of the IFIs do that. I think the closest that comes to doing really strongly on that is probably the Inter-American Development Bank, then the ADB. I want to flag for you, because what I'm using to make that a judgment is a lovely paper that Priti pointed me to, which I think we all should be aware of. It's called Unmet Gender Promises, Making IFI Policies and Projects Deliver on Gender and Equal Rights, by, I believe it's Elaine Zuckerman, but Gender Action. And so I want to flag a few things, because they went through and they looked at all of the IFIs, not climate, all of the IFIs, and they ranked them in terms of indicators as to how strong they were, how weak they were, inadequate or adequate they were on integrating gender in their framework. And I must tell you that none of them come out very well. In terms of looking at the attempt to, well, first we must say none of the environmental social safeguard or anything that looks at gender takes into account social reproduction or women's unpaid work when you're assessing the impact and the cost and dealing with issues of compensation and resettlement. So that's a missing thing right there that we need to address. None of them, many of them are very good. I think the World Bank, ADB, and IDB have been very good in terms of facilitating women's participation in consultation and in some jobs at some level. None of them takes into consideration childcare or transportation and how that might impact women and men, even when you have forced or involuntary resettlement issues. So gender is not included at all of the project level. And of course, we know there's widespread incidents, we've heard it, of doing a lot of harm. So one of the proposal is that instead of framing the ESG as not doing harm, we should frame the ESG as doing good. And of course, gender sensitize them in terms of looking at issues of unpaid work, issues of women's and men's access to resources and raw and natural resources, and linking ecosystems and natural systems to some of these. So none of them have this mandatory gender alone policy as part of their ESG framework. So we need to get that in, that there should be, if the climate funds can have a standalone gender policy and gender mainstreaming, there's no reason why the World Bank, which has been for years telling us about gender and women's rights and so forth, cannot have ESG that has gender as a standalone thing, which include all of the things I mentioned. Unpaid work, access to childcare, those kinds of things as part of looking at issues of resettlement and compensation. Also looking at intersectionality, right? So we heard, as Sibeli talked about, farm women who have many different lives that they're living. They're teachers, they're doctors, some of them are indigenous groups, some of them are ethnic minorities, and I'm sure we'll hear from Brazil also. So the intersectionality is very important if you're looking at gender and you think that's important. So these are all some of the things that should be flagged in. I want to just end by looking a little bit, I think I hear Priti saying I should wrap up, so I will wrap up. But in terms of the NDB, still on the 2016, which they were supposed to review the 2016 ESG And I haven't found anywhere where there's a new version of it. So I'm going by the 2016. So if people have a 2017 or 2018. So they were very weak in terms of increasing gender in environmental and social assessment. They were very weak in terms of including gender in terms of non-discrimination and climate issues and environmental issue. Also very weak in terms of integrating gender in monitoring and assessment. And also, especially so, for, as was pointed out by Sibeli, on gender and sexual and sexual and LGBTQI issues. And also very weak, all of them, very weak on following up and integrating, even though their policies talk about some of it, gender-based violence and sexual harassment of women. The only place where the NDB came up adequate in this ranking that was done by Gender Action was in terms of gender consultation. They came up strong in terms of gender and resettlement and compensation. So those of you who are in the field can say if that's true. I think they were looking at the proposals and projects, and they gave an example of some projects in different regions of the world. But all of it was that lacking of gender, flouting of gender conditions, and lack of coherence between gender and the social and environmental assessment.
Okay.
And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariama. And if you could put some of that, if you do have the link to that report and you could put it in the chat, that would be great.
I don't have the link, but I will put the report.
I was thinking we would now go to Patricia Chavez, and I think Mariama talked about the Inter-American Bank being one of the better examples of using or integrating gender analysis or gender sensitivity into their systems. Patricia, you've been working in Brazil on women's livelihoods and land rights. So can you just take the floor and let us know a little bit about your work, but also how you see the issues of country systems and gender equality?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm gonna turn off my video because you know, my image is not so good. It's matching with the picture. So I work in an organization called Feminist Space for Democracy and Human Rights. We work all over Brazil, although we are set in the northeast area of Brazil, which is the poorest area of Brazil. But we have, you know, we build networks with women's organizations. We are feminist organizations. And through these networks, we work at also at national and through other, let's say, networks such as International Land Coalition and other global networks. We work from the ground, from the local to the global. And what I'm gonna present is based on this kind of experience. And what we say is that we have to look to work globally, locally, and you know, link to the global, growing through the regional levels. And my presentation, sorry if I disappoint you, is going to be very grounded. What I'm gonna present right now is an experience, and it was a project, an assessment, an analysis that we did over the last 3 years on the one major development project that was funded by the National Bank, Development Bank, that received funds from diverse sources, and it was also funded by the local government. So it was public investment on a promise in an area that has over the last 5 centuries been dominated by the sugarcane plantations with the lowest social, let's say, indicators. So I'm going to present the very basic and very concrete example. And just for you to understand in Brazil, we have a wonderful, wonderful, let's say, normal social system and normative. We have the best, we say that we have the best constitution. We have signed for all the CEDAW, all the international legislation, and in principle, we have, we have all these integrated in our constitutions and other national regulations. But how it is implemented in practice? So in 2018, we saw an opportunity to really analyze from a gender perspective a project that was implemented in one area called in the Northeast, using billions of dollars of public investment to set up a new, how can I say, a new development that would benefit the whole population. We have access to good data, and we saw the opportunity to compare the agricultural census that is collected by our National Statistic Office, IBGE, and we had two census, the 2006 and the 2017. So we saw an opportunity to compare the data using the SDGs as a framework. We are talking about using the goals 1, 2, 5, and 11, and some of the indicators to analyze the impacts of this public investment on women's lives. So that's what I'm going to focus. And of course, reinforcing that we had a very progressive national system and regulations. And at that moment, we were looking at, at how in practice were the impacts of this project. So as I said, we use this agricultural census, and the findings were disturbing on the negative impact of billions of dollars spent from the public investment were negatively impacting women's livelihood. So what we did, it was so impacting the results, and it was so disturbing in relation to what was promised by the government and by the banks in terms of, a new development for a very, how can I say, depressed area that was secularly, let's say, dedicated to sugarcane plantation and with the lowest social indicators. So it was a good chance to change the development in this area. What happened in the fact, and it was really amazing, and it was so disturbing that we could not just rely on the secondary data. After getting all this data, comparing to the same population in the 11 years' time, we had so shocking information and data that I'm going to share some of with you, that we had to go back, and since we work with very diverse women's constituency, going from quilombolas or Afro-descendants communities to rural workers, fish women organizations, the disturbing numbers and figures and data that we had call on the need to go back and ask this constituency and check the information to see if it was right. And we don't do this just because we want to provide some good analysis. We do this because we are monitoring the development project as well as engaging in advocacy. And we used to say that we do this from a bottom up. We believe that it's at the local level and the state level that women can influence in the policies and can have, you know, and can change the political agenda. So it was a very practical way of saying we can do something to change the different women's groups' condition by building the evidence and then engaging in kind of advocacy with the state government. And we expected to do it national government, but we are not doing any longer, but also sharing this kind of information, impacts, and you know, findings with the international community. So just for you to have an idea, in one of these areas, and I'm talking about in Guyana, between 2006 and 2017, the GDP increased by something around 700%, but the social policies investment didn't increase. All contrary, there was a decrease in social policies, and we are talking about education, health, sanitation, housing, besides the investment in transforming the food production, freeing people from the monoculture of sugarcane. In that zone, 96% of the population, women in especially in the large majority, lives with less than 2 minimum wage per family. In Guyana, which was the major area of development, and we are talking about plant of 30 chrysalids, besides all other investment, we had an increase of, you know, we have an increase in investment that it was huge in building infrastructure that did not benefit at all the women from the ground, especially grassroots women. We are talking about 96% of the population receiving less than 2 minimum wages. Is horrible for us. So in Guyana, for you just to have an idea, in Guyana, the size of the agricultural land in the name of women dropped dramatically between 2006 to 2017. And in 2006, around 55% of the land that was in the name of women account for around 3 hectares. And in 2017, that dropped for 0.1 hectares of land. And it represents 60% of the women that held the land in their names. So we start asking, okay, so what is the industry? At least they are offering jobs for these women, or at least for the next generation. Is there any kind of programs that is dealing with the future generations in education, training, preparing this future generation for the big you know, development in this area? And what we saw is no, not at all. These industries are causing a lot of pollution and then contaminating all the waters and all the causes of waters, rivers, and everything else. Another find is that, all contrary of what was promised by the Development Bank and the government, you know, we also found that the sugar plantation didn't drop at all. So, and the most impressive thing was that the people which had land from the agrarian reform programs, since they didn't have any kind of investment or support from the state, we are talking about national and the state programs that we had in the past, they simply had to live the food production and start producing sugarcane to maintain the sugarcane industry. So we had, you know, this huge development project impacting negatively in many aspects of women's lives. And so what are we really looking for? As a feminist groups, the first thing is that we have been using this data and this evidence to inform groups and doing a lot of, how can I say, we call the...
Conscientizing.
Yeah. Improving, increasing the knowledge of women, and also capacity building and building networks to confront the government and confront the industries and the bank to say, look, you promised, that was the promise. That's what we achieved 5 years after the project was developed. So what I'm trying to say here is the national regulation, the national systems are not protecting us. The public investment in state and national governments do not protect us. So we have to protect ourselves. And I think that I do say in all the spaces that building evidence, and we were very lucky to have access to national statistic data, comparing these periods and confronting to the promise of a national, you know, development program, and saying, okay, what's next? How can, we are not just saying that they are bad and, you know, they fail to deliver what was promised. We want more. We want somehow that they comply with what was promised. So we start showing these figures, these numbers, the data, this evidence to the government and say, okay, now you have to build some kind of compensation for those women. And that's my question. And that's why I am here to ask you, how can we build a platform to raise these questions and demand compensation from state governments and national banks? What are the mechanisms that we can use? We have started presenting these findings to demand changes, effective changes, and more investment that can improve women's livelihood, demanding for the return of public investment in food production, especially in the moment, a dramatic moment of COVID and post-COVID, and you know, the failure of food production and food distribution in our country. The rise of prices are impressive.
Patricia, can we
Can
we take it to the next discussion about how we can actually, what are the platforms we can use? Because I think that's a question, that's an issue that is across all of the countries that we just talked about. Can you just wind up so I can go on to the next speaker?
Yeah. So what we are asking for is what kind of effective international South-South cooperation can we build to be more effective in monitoring and also in advocating for different kind of development projects. And we are using different platforms to raise these questions and looking at the different mechanisms that we have. We use the development community to listen to those women's organizations working on the ground and facing the increased challenge imposed by COVID. So we are urging the different actors and the different platforms, international funding and platform investment groups, to look at these on the ground experience and evidence and help us to build from bottom up, you know, experiences and
okay, Patricia, thank
examples.
you. We can come back to you, right? I just want to give Zhu Cheng a chance to kind of say, so we can come back in the discussion about those platforms and how we can use them. I think that's a really valuable point. But if you don't mind, can I just go on to Zhu Cheng so that she can tell us a little bit about her experience of working with she's also been collecting evidence and done a recent scoping study where they looked at gender mainstreaming in the IFIs in some Chinese financial institutions. So if Zhu Cheng can actually talk to us about that, it would probably complement a lot of what you've just said, Patricia. So if you don't mind, if you can hold it for a moment, we will go to Zhu Cheng and come back to you. Okay? So Zhu Cheng, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Prithyanti, and thank you all the presenters before. Thank you for your amazing presentations. And I'm Zhiqian Zhao from Green Innovation Hub, also known as G-Hub. We're an environmental think-do organization based in China, Beijing, China. And we promote development and implementation of sound in climate and environmentally friendly policies in China through analysis, research, and engaging with different stakeholders. And I've been working on sustainable finance and Chinese overseas investments. And we share the concerns about IFIs and especially the country systems' impacts on gender equality and women's rights. However, our work sort of come from a slightly different perspective, and I'm going to share that, and I really hope that I can keep you interested in our work. And we're more focused and concerned with financial institutions in China at the national level, mainly include state-owned banks in China, as well as development banks in China. And why is that so? Firstly, we're quite new to the issues of gender, and we set out from our previous work in greening Chinese overseas investments from environmental accountability and climate resilient perspectives. And also secondly, as you all know, China's size of overseas investments is ever growing and presumably also assuming greater global responsibilities and also being involved in sort of new IFIs such as AIB and NDB. So we think it is of great importance as well as presenting a great opportunity to promote better social performance of Chinese FIs, especially on gender. And that's sort of where we start our work. And previously, we have been engaging with some of Chinese FIs and industry associations, and we have identified some huge gaps as well as huge opportunities in our opinion. And firstly, the idea of gender equality and equality between men and women is included as some part of corporate social responsibility and the sustainability commitment of several major FIs, but it's mainly only concerning internal governance. And we also found out that it's also partly state sanctioned. And secondly, gender is really hardly considered as relevant to financing activities. This is also reflected in their investment and risk management policies. But thirdly, we have also heard some words of interest through our sort of this research that people are interested in the topic of gender and sustainable finance, especially on the framework of SDGs. And although it seems that it's the links between gender and sustainable finance appears to be a lot more difficult to make in comparison to the environment related issues. And so now I want to also highlight the broader background to sort of discussing gender and sustainable finance in China, which would be the sort of macro policy background. And China is the signatory of CEDAW, and also in 1995, China has set out a national basic policy on gender equality, and also recently on occasion of the 25th years anniversary of the Fourth World Conference on Women, which was held in Beijing. And the national government also made reiterated some of their commitment to gender equality in China. So this is the sort of the broad background. And in order, well, for our aims is to push for Chinese FIs to take on the gender lens in their sort of activities and investments. And one of the key parts of our work will be to make the connection between these national commitments and policies and the financing activities of Chinese FIs. And sort of as part of this advocacy, we conducted a scoping study on IFIs, mainstreaming of gender, and we looked at the history and case studies of why IFIs started to take on a gender perspective. We also looked at the policy tools and governance structure that IFI uses to mainstream gender. And we sort of emphasize on two key approaches of IFIs to mainstream gender, the first of which is do no harm on gender, and the second of which is their commitments to promote gender equality through their activities, while also taking the consideration and emphasizing on the differences among the FIs in their respective mandates and gender related goals and their implementation. And I believe this differences has been well addressed by the other presenter now sort of in this panel. Well, in the future, we will sort of start some domestic policy advocacy and enabling work for Chinese FIs and banks based on this research, and a reference framework for gender sensitive investment that we have put together based on some of this work. And I have to sort of also emphasize that we really take IFIs as an approach rather than regarding their practices as best practices. But we believe taking as IFIs as an advocacy approach is more suiting to the Chinese context and more sort of useful for framing of our messages. And we want to promote for better inclusion of a gender perspective in the risk management and financing policies and mechanisms among Chinese FIs, and in the future, taking on the position as a watchdog over the impacts on gender, which is a slightly different, well, pretty different position from the IFI watchdogs. But I believe there are many ways that we can cross paths or collaborate with our colleagues here. And many of the women's groups and feminist groups here on the panel, and I believe as well also in the audience, are extensively experienced in assessing the impacts of development financing through a gender lens and in campaigning for better accountabilities of IFIs and relevant stakeholders. We believe there's a lot we could draw from in terms of methods and approaches. What we can approach is our insights in the realities of gender and finance in China. But China is becoming increasingly influential in both multilateral and bilateral affairs. And some of our colleagues here might find their works involves having to engage with Chinese stakeholders, especially the national ones. We hope that our work could be helpful for them to frame their messages to different stakeholders in China. Well, for us as well, the work of those groups who could gather about on-the-ground evidence and put together in-depth gender analysis, your work is very important for us. So we're hoping that we can keep a good information flow and for future collaborative efforts. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chu Sheng. I was just thinking, thank you very much, because I think it's the fact that we have you on this panel. We've had representations from all the BRICS countries here, and I think that has been quite a amazing insight into how this South Alliance, that is BRICS, can actually promote or cannot or is not, or how we can encourage it to promote more and be more accountable for gender equality and human rights for women and marginalized groups. So thank you so much for that. I just want to ask Shubha if there are any particular, let's do this the other way around. Are there any questions from the chat that you would like to share with the panelists?
Sorry, there have been some interesting questions that have come up. One is for Miriam specifically to ask her what she meant when she was talking about the normative framework. Did she mean that safeguards without the normative frameworks are quite useless? And to dwell a minute on the normative framework that she said is missing even in the World Bank. Another question was about what are feminist groups doing to sort of, in relation to the damage and the violation by BRICS countries on indigenous women, and also whether we can look at issues around transparency and accountability more from a procedural and legal perspective, rather than just use a broad human rights framework.
Okay, so 3 questions again. Can I ask Mariama, you have the question which is directly to you, which is about what did you mean by the normative framework? Mariama?
Yes, so normative for me basically is you're starting with a rights framework. So you're looking at, you're grounding all of the safeguards and all of the various rights framework that we have. We have rights for indigenous people. We have rights on elderly youth. We have rights, we have a whole host of both a global convention, but also a regional convention. So for example, in Latin America, you have a lot of human rights convention. In Africa. So if you start and by grounding the approach to environmental and social safeguards in those rights, then you're on a very firm footing. And then you're not in a situation where you then are determining based on neoliberal economic policy, what is important, what's the value that you want to, because what we have now, I mean, despite this idea that somehow country systems devolve to national law and legal system, we know that on the quote unquote important areas of macroeconomic policy, that is not left to the device of country system. That is determined by neoclassical economic analysis that's infused in the World Bank. And so those policy framework comes from there. When they talk about the PMF, a budgetary system, the budgetary framework comes from where? The World Bank, the IMF. But none of those are grounded in what matters to people's life in terms of the impact for people, in terms of employment, in terms of access to resources, in terms of ensuring that they have homes, they have quality health care. But we do have rights. We have an overriding rights system that all of the governments who are members of WTO, World Bank, IMF purport to believe in. And so if we start with that as the grounding for these environmental and social safeguards, then you're in a very safe ground. And I'm not talking about building in macroeconomic conditionality. I think that there are some things that we need to avoid. We need to avoid those kind of straitjacket, but we do need to make sure that whatever policies that are put in place in terms of borrowers and country lending are grounded in things that meets people's realities in terms of where they are. And we do have, and even the countries themselves have gender policies and gender mainstreaming processes going on. And so those can be part of that discussion. And I think you can have that discussion. It's not unilateral. I'm not asking about unilaterally imposing things. I'm asking about having that discussion. And that includes the developed countries who themselves are members of these institutions and who push particular policies when it suits them. Yeah? Okay.
Thank you. That was very clear and very to the point. We have the other question, I think both came from Laurie or someone in the audience, which is about what are feminist groups doing about the aggression by BRICS countries on indigenous people's rights. Is that right, Shubha? Is that what the question was? Yeah. Is there anybody who would like to take that on? It doesn't have to be just the last three panelists. Is Patricia or
yes.
Yeah.
I think that we just came from a Latin America gathering, forum, and one of the topic issues was the aggression from, international institutions and all the, international development organizations on indigenous land. And what is the voice of the indigenous land? And we are connected to many indigenous groups in Brazil. What they are saying is that no one is protecting them, So they have to protect. The resistance is building from the territories to the global. So they are demanding more, how can I say, more support from the global community, and they are saying that no, the FAO, none of those institutions are really protecting them from the massive destruction of their territories, of their rights, because they are the traditional people who live here. And we are not just talking about indigenous population, we are also talking, and it's very important for us to talk about the Afro-descendants, the people that we call quilombolas, that have great pieces of land that they have owned for many centuries, and they are being invaded, they are being grabbed, and they are being taken because of the interest of some development projects. So the answer to this question is, how can we protect these populations in Latin America? Because they don't feel that there is any mechanism, that there is any international organization that is really supporting them. So what they feel and what they say, FIMI has just released a report about the situation that they are facing. And it's like we have to do ourselves, and we have to link to, the platforms and, the different organizations, civil society organizations that are really able to support them. So in response to this, the question is how these different platforms, South-South corporations, BRICS Feminist Watch, can really come up with some support for these groups, because really some communities and some people are just going to disappear. We are seeing in Brazil is really a massive genocide of the indigenous population.
Okay, that's a very sad note to move from. So, but I think I will have to, in the interest of time, because we have with us also Butch Montes, who's a senior advisor at the Society for International Development, and he's been sitting and listening to all of us very quietly for the last 1.5 hours almost. And so I would like him as a sort of overarching discussant to this seminar to ask actually what are your views about what we've talked about coming from your perspective, looking at things like international debt, but also in terms, also if you can say a few words about how you think all of this pans out currently in this current pandemic. Is this an opportunity, or is this are there opportunities in the way we are rethinking our existential crisis almost that we can actually build on? Butch, it's yours. Please say something about yourself too.
Thank you very much, Priyanti, and very nice. I am sometime working with the United Nations, and before that I was with the Ford Foundation, where I met many of the colleagues here in this network. And after that, I worked for the South Center, which is co-hosting this session. And now I'm sort of retired from 4 of these or 5 of these groups. I used to be a faculty member in the Philippines, so I'm a Filipino. Let me just say very quickly what I wanted to say. I always thought that the feminist perspective was a very important analytical and theoretical perspective, and also one that could actually look into how we organize our societies, right? And what the pandemic actually shows is that a lot of the things that are missing from I'm an economist by training, right? A lot of things that are missing from standard economics could actually be filled by feminist analysis, right? Usual economics, neoclassical economics, does not even have money. But even that, even if you add money to the usual economics, you don't have social reproduction, right? And this pandemic actually creates a lot of insight and forces us to look into what social reproduction actually means, right? And the kind of ideas that you get out of feminist economics is that how do you solve a social problem? How do you solve a collective problem, right? And what a lot of many societies historically had imposed the collective problems on some of their subpopulations, on their women especially, on the indigenous peoples, in order to solve many of these collective problems. So this kind of framework is very powerful. But what I really want to say, just to react to what I've just heard, right, is that the power of this kind of framework has actually been proven again by the kind of discussions we have actually had right here. It's a very powerful question that you're asking in this session, right? What do you do with country systems, right? We know that IFI funding are public monies. And we know that the duty holders of human rights are the governments to which this money is being lent to. And a long time ago, when we were activists like Mariama on the debt issue, we were very much involved in making sure that it was the countries that actually had the control over how they were getting their financing and what they would do with it, and how they would be made whole by any kind of restructuring, right? So it's a very difficult problem that you're solving. And one of the things that what I learned from here is that a lot of countries can actually say that we have country systems that are being violated by this kind of external financing, right? So the question is, how do you prevent the conditionality from? How do you prevent, let's say, gender as just another way of conditionality on developing countries? You know, I used to work with the UN, and one of the things that I used to be very sensitive about is that the developed countries would always use gender as a hammer against developing countries, but at the same time their own, and this is brought up today, right? Let's say by Ella, but at the same time the way they were controlling their these international financial institutions, that they were doing it in a very accountable way. So unaccountable way, and actually in favor of their own interests, right? So let me just talk about some of the things that I think we should take out in more concrete terms from the discussion. First of all, I really appreciated Sibulele's issue about, and I think pretty about infrastructure norms, right? Infrastructure And I hope this can be, for funding for infrastructure projects that can be set as standard for everybody, right? I'm from a very old generation. It used to be the dam projects, right? But now this is actually a very exciting possibility, right? To bring in the feminist framework, to put it into the infrastructure issue, which is a very important issue for developing countries, right? No, and Mariama talked about the normative framework. What was put out today was that these IFIs do not have a normative framework. Now that's a very hard thing for them to do, right? Because in these IFIs, secondly, our own officials who are our representatives in this IFI. When I say our developing countries, right? Our own officials who are in this IFIs might not be very strong supporters of putting up normative standards in their operations. But Mariama just pointed out that the GCF already has it, right? So in effect, some of these arguments can actually be made by saying, well, some of these institutions already have it. Can we actually have them in the World Bank, for example, right? The other thing that I really learned is the question, and this is a very important issue that, again, you pick up from the feminist economics framework, right? The Brazilian case, right, in which there were projects, they were well-meaning, and there was a lot of growth, but all the growth didn't happen to the people, right? This is for me, one of the most valuable things about this discussion, right, is not only the understanding of these things happening, right? And we know that we have been doing this for many of the issues that we've been involved in, right? And I'm very grateful to Preeti, right, for putting this network together, right? But the kinds of methodologies that have been pioneered in each one of these studies should be something that if we could share among ourselves, among the network, right? Because other people in other places can try to put the same methodologies to make analytical arguments and to inform or to strengthen their advocacy, right? This idea about infrastructure, this idea about growth without growth for everybody, right? Growth only for some people, and there's financing that is coming from public sources and private sources too. This is a very powerful kind of an insight that came out of this discussion. So let me end with just one idea, right? This is, Pretty. This is what is it? This is the BRICS network, right? But it's a South-South agenda. So it's a very powerful. There's a very powerful kinds of possibilities out of this, right? There should be a way in which you could set up a network among the people who are involved, right? And the people who have been part of this discussion, so that we can share analysis, so we can share methodologies, so we can share our politics with each other and our own experiences. So I want to say thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I learned a lot from this discussion, and I hope, first of all, I not only learned a lot, I'm very optimistic, right? I know that the mountain to climb is very, very high. This idea of country systems, you don't want it to be conditionality and all that stuff. But I'm very, very optimistic that a lot of work is being done and a lot of progress is possible. Thank you very much. Thank you, Priyanti. Yeah?
Thank you very much. I do apologize. My connection keeps going in and out. I come in and out of this conversation. But thank you very much, Butch, for that. We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm afraid we don't really have time to take many more questions from the audience, though we would have very much liked to. But I think Butch kind of landed this on a good place about how we kind of build this South-South cooperation among ourselves, which is what Patricia also highlighted. And we also saw how important it was to have the voices of the feminists, the voices of the women, actually thinking of country systems, not just as country systems of the state, but also the country systems that we are part of, that our advocacy is part of. So how do we strengthen that by working together? And as organizers of this, can I just ask Preeti and Shubha to have the last word? No, before I ask that, is there anybody who wants, out of the panelists, who want to say something really that they really missed out saying? So if so, just unmute your mic and say it in one sentence. Okay, if not, then can I ask Preeti and Shubha as sort of the co-organizers of this to tell us how we are going to take this forward?
Shubha, why don't you go ahead?
You can go first, Preeti. I'll just do the sum.
I will add whatever. Why don't you?
Okay, so we just wanted to end by thanking everybody for being here, and also to thank Henry Bowl Foundation India for making this happen, supporting us. We will, just as next steps, there will be a paper that we're writing, Preeti and I are writing, and your inputs will go into that paper. And of course, the video of this fantastic feast that we had today will be available for everybody. And I just want to end by saying that, yes, the idea that Butch spoke about building solidarity and building a South voice and building capacities in our own countries, building the ability to see and making accountability real. I mean, it's not just going to be on paper, but how to make it real so that the lives of people who are most impacted by these projects, that they get to have a say in those processes. I think that's the dream. And I will end with this, and Preeti, of course, besides Preeti and this, you can take.
So I wanted to thank everyone from all the organizers. And I think Butch kind of drew our attention to the real criticalness of us as South feminists to not just come together, but really nurture and sustain our collective energy and this work further. So I would, of course, BRICS Feminist Watch is a feminist space. And I would, if you are not part of it, please do write to us and join us, and let's challenge each other. Let's be each other's support and learning, sharing together in how we move forward. We may not have all the answers, but as Butch said, we are in the right direction, and more power to us. And let's continue this upward climbing of this monstrous hill. So thank you, everyone. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. And with that, we should close the seminar and say bye to everybody.
And thanks, Priyanti, for hosting.
And yeah, we all see you again next time.
Thank you very much.
Bye.